I wanted to see if I could automate virtual machine deployments. I've set a few rules. No pressure. All right, we've written our first workflow, and now it's time to run it. Let's go do it. And we'll click run to run this workflow. Let's see, virtual machine name. Why don't we call this virtual machine myVM-0000. We'll click run. And we'll give it a short little while to run here. By the way, while it's running, if you go over to the vSphere client and look in the recent tasks section, let me resize this here. Notice you can see that the virtual machine is being created. Actually, it's already done. This task represents the creation of that virtual machine. So if we go back to Orchestrator, you can see that that workflow completed successfully, and we have, as a result, created our first virtual machine. Now, if you want to prove to yourself that that worked, you could go to the vSphere client. You could go into the VMs and templates view, and in that folder we created called My VM folder, notice that we have a virtual machine called My VM-001. All right, so we are well on the way to completing this challenge. We now have the ability to create one VM at a time. But you'll recall my rule said that we need to be able to create multiple VMs using an Orchestrator workflow. So what we're going to do is going to be a similar process to what we just saw, using techniques that you've already learned about. In particular, we're going to rely upon the ability to call another workflow, and we need to know how to do that parameter binding business. Oh, wait, just before we do that, if we go to Orchestrator, if we close this workflow, run and close this workflow, if you want to see from Orchestrator whether or not the VM was created successfully, you could go to Administration, Inventory. Again, this is an inventory of all the objects that can be seen by all of the plugins that are installed. We're going to find and open up the vCenter plugin. And this inventory should look familiar. It looks just like we saw before when we were creating our inputs and outputs and variables. And if we keep drilling down here, in the folder called VM, there is a subfolder called My VM folder. And once again, we can see the virtual machine that we just created called My VM-0000. By the way, that's going to be our naming convention for the VMs we create. They're all going to be called My VM dash and then a 4-digit number that increases sequentially. Okay, let's go back to Library Workflows. And in Library Workflows, you can see the new workflow that we just created. And as a reminder, that workflow, the way it works is that workflow calls out to another workflow. Or another way of saying that is my workflow is wrapping this workflow. Now that wrapping technique gets used again and again and again and again and again and again when Orchestrator workflow developers create their workflows. And part of what you can do with this wrapping that we just did in this example is you can take a workflow that is perhaps more complex than you want, or take a workflow that requires more information than you want the user to be able to control, and by wrapping it in your workflow, you can change the way this is going to work. Now, we're not actually changing the inputs and outputs or the functionality of that other workflow. It remains in its pristine original state, but our workflow is going to be able to behave differently. For example, remember how we created a whole bunch of variables? Again, these are my variables in my workflow, but there's only one input. So what I've done is I've wrapped the other workflow, which has something like a dozen different inputs. By wrapping that workflow in my workflow and only exposing one input, I have, in effect, simplified the way this is going to work. So if a user calls the other workflow, they have to answer 12 different questions. On the other hand, if they call my workflow, they only have to answer one question. What is the name of the virtual machine that you want to create? So again, that's one thing you could do with parameter binding. You can simplify the functionality or simplify the inputs. On the flip side, you can also use wrapping to add functionality, but that's a whole nother topic. Excellent! Our first workflow ran successfully. but it can only create one VM at a time. Join me in the next video and I'll show you how to create another workflow that can create multiple virtual machines.